Good morning and welcome. I'm Jim Perkins, and I welcome you to the 5th in the OLLI program series, Foreign Culture and American Foreign Policy, with a presentation today on North and South Korea. A couple of logistics items as we usually take care of. The restrooms are through those double doors at the back, and please take this opportunity to turn off all cell phones or other electronic devices. We are video recording all of the program sessions, including the question and answer portion. The videos will be used for educational purposes in our school systems, as we have received requests for these videos from schools including the University of Virginia. Now, if you object to being shown in the videos, please see me after the program concludes. We will have a question and answer session at the conclusion of Professor Dimberg's presentation, and the professors have all agreed to video these as well because they can be an important part of the information that's being provided. Now, if you have a question, please queue up at the microphones over here on my right, and there are two mics. If you'll stand up close, one is for the video and the other is for the audience. At this time, I want to acknowledge again the students from Western, and these students are here compliments of OLLI and through the kind permission of the Superintendent of Albemarle County Schools, Pam Moran, as arranged by Jennifer Sublette, who is the facilitator of the Social Studies program. We're honored today to have as our guest Professor Ronald Dimberg. He is Associate Professor in the Department of History at the University of Virginia. Professor Dimberg has a distinction of serving for 44 years here at UVA and is retiring at the end of this semester. I think that deserves a round of applause, don't you? That's a real accomplishment. When Professor Dimberg set up his retirement, he anticipated this last year to be one of gradually lightening his course load, giving up his position as Director of Graduate Studies and taking it easy. Instead, the Dean asked Ron to take on the additional assignment as Assistant Dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. So instead of having less work, he is holding down 2 full jobs this year and still find time to address us today. A native Californian from Turlock, Professor Dimberg received his BA at the University of Oregon, where he continued his postgraduate education, obtaining 2 master's degrees, one in history and the second in East Asian Studies. He continued his postgraduate work at Columbia University, where he received his PhD in the Department of Chinese and Japanese Languages. His dissertation was on a 16th century Chinese political dissident and activist. He came to UVA in 1968 and joined the history department, teaching pre-modern China. In 1993, he started teaching on Korea exclusively. He has also taught at the Darden Graduate School of Business and for about 11 years was the Director for International Studies. He taught at Darden a course on the cultural context of international business in East Asia, a topic that fits well for our program series today. Professor Dimberg's expertise on the 2 Koreas is widely recognized. 5 times he has been asked to share his knowledge with Department of Defense activities. He can say where he was, but he cannot state with whom, nor tell who he shared this knowledge with. He can say that there were 3-day seminars where first names only were used, that these were members of the U.S. Intelligence community, and that the subject was Korean politics and North and South Korean relations. We are pleased to have such a highly qualified scholar speak to us today on the unclassified topic, the culture of North and South Korea and American foreign policy. Please welcome Professor Dimberg.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. After hearing all of that, I think I may just retire. In shortly. All right, you do that. Thank you. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I have been looking forward to this for some time.
It is a welcome break from some of the activities in which I've been involved over the past, past several months. I will not deny that I look forward to promised retirement, but that doesn't mean, that does not mean I'm going to stop thinking and reading about Korea. I said earlier, when I was meeting some of you in the audience, the only thing I enjoy discussing more than Korea is baseball. And I certainly intend to do some of that as well. The point about the importance of culture in policy making and the importance of culture to policymakers is well made in the literature about this course. I particularly appreciate the comment made by Professor Ramazani when he talks about the cultural deficit in American foreign policy making. And I'm sure that the other participants in this course have made that point with great clarity and force over the last 3 or 4 weeks. My role is to illustrate the importance of cultural characteristics in policy making with regards to Korea, or the Koreas. My predecessors in this program, the same thing goes for Brantley Womack, who will be here next week, have had the leisure of dealing with one country. But a careful look at a map of, we'll start with this one, whether it's the political map or the topographical map of Northeast Asia, reveals that Korea is by far the smallest of all the geographical places under consideration. And yet Korea comprises 2 separate countries. You've heard about Russia, India, Egypt, Japan, you're going to hear about China. My problem was this: do I deal with one of the 2 Koreas, making life relatively simple for myself, or do I try to identify a common cultural characteristic that cuts across the barriers of the demilitarized zone, the barriers of ideology and system, and try to explain how a common cultural characteristic, shared in common by both North and South, expresses itself, albeit differently, in the North and in the South. Which do I do? I must say that the existence of 2 countries on the Korean Peninsula, of course, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the North and the Republic of Korea in the South, prompted me some years ago to extend a 2-semester sequence on Korea to 3 semesters, because otherwise I realized I simply was not doing justice to both countries. And in fact, as we all know, or I'm assuming as we all know, the 2 countries came into existence in 1948. Now, I am surprised by the number of people who continue to ask me why the Koreans divided themselves and when this happened. So let me take one moment here, and I don't want to be condescending, but I want to be absolutely certain everyone realizes what happened on the Korean Peninsula in the mid-1940s, to explain the origins of the 2. With the end of, and I'll give you a brief overview, a very brief overview of Korean history in a moment, but at the end of World War II, at the end of the Pacific War in August 15, 1945, liberation of the Korean people from Japanese colonial rule, the peninsula was partitioned along the 38th parallel. Soviet forces occupied the north, U.S. forces occupied the south. This was to have been a temporary partition pending the day when reunification would occur. Well, unfortunately, one thing led to another. There was the irony of the Korean War that was supposed to reunite the peninsula, but in fact established the enduring partition. And here we are more than 65 years later, 65 years after what was to have been a temporary partition. So do I focus on one or do I focus on both? I've decided to identify a common cultural theme that does, in fact, in my mind, transcend the barriers of the DMZ systems and ideologies, expressed one way in the North and another way in the South. Now, I take a very broad view of culture. There are many, the last time I checked, there were over 230 definitions of culture out there. Now on the internet, when I started looking, I looked at books. But now you can find all of this on the internet. I focus on a very broad definition, an inclusive definition of culture. Culture is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, customs, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by members of a society. That is about as inclusive as you can get, folks. But and I do that purposely. I do that purposely. Now, a brief historical background to, I hope, and in the process here this morning, I may raise more questions than I answer, so feel free to look for answers and ask for answers during the question and answer period. But I want to give you a very brief overview of Korean history, drawing attention to some persistent cultural characteristics that we can trace back to the Three Kingdoms period and that persisted into the late 19th, early 20th century. I'm not going to go through all of these periods for you and explain what distinguished one from the other, but you get some sense there on this side here of dates and the sequence of dynasties in Korean history. But I do want to focus attention for a moment on a couple of indigenous cultural elements that we can trace back to the Three Kingdoms period and that persisted on the peninsula into the late 19th and into the 20th century. First, a rigid, hereditary social hierarchy, with the division, most simply put, between the rulers at the top and everybody else at the bottom, the ruled. Now, in time, that category of the ruled would be subdivided into 3 or 4 categories, but for purposes of simplicity, the rulers and the ruled, a rigid, hereditary, hierarchically arranged social system. The reason for being for the ruled was to provide for the rulers. That was their only reason for being, to support the ruling class. Secondly, related obviously to the first, is the existence of a genuine hereditary aristocracy. And I emphasize the term genuine. We often use that term aristocracy inaccurately and inappropriately. When I talk about a genuine aristocracy, I mean a limited number of very large clans, families and clans, that monopolized. They didn't just dominate, they monopolized all forms of power: political, social, cultural, economic. Now, in addition to these two indigenous cultural characteristics that persisted into the late 19th and into the early 20th century, I also want to discuss for a moment the status of the Three Kingdoms and the Shilla, the United Shilla dynasty, as secondary states. Historians and archaeologists and others referred to the Three Kingdoms and perhaps even unified Shilla as secondary states, meaning simply that as they emerged, there already existed on the continent a highly sophisticated culture, Chinese culture. Right? That highly sophisticated culture had been evolving on the continent already for centuries by the time the Three Kingdoms started to emerge to be unified under the Shilla. It is not surprising, therefore, that the peninsula was heavily influenced by continental culture. All right? That the Three Kingdoms, and then the Shilla, and then the Korea, and then the Chosun were all, were all influenced by continental culture. Now, it is important to understand here, and I very sensitive about this, so I emphasize this: the Chinese did not impose their culture on the Koreans. Right? The elite in the Three Kingdoms and following periods voluntarily adopted elements of continental culture. This was not a wholesale adopted. They selectively adopted elements of continental culture and then adapted those elements to the local political and social and cultural and economic terrain, so that we see developing on the peninsula a unique, distinctive Korean cultural tradition, heavily informed by the continent. But we're not talking here about an outpost of Chinese culture, an extension of Chinese culture, a colony of the Chinese, no. Something that is influenced by the continent, but then develops its own unique and distinctive cultural tradition. This happened with institutions, for example. They adopted from the continent, the continental style, Chinese style, bureaucracy. Some people don't realize that one of the earliest, if not the earliest, bureaucratic form of government existed in China. This was adapted by the Koreans. They also adapted the Chinese-style civil service examination system that was used to staff the bureaucracy. Obviously, in a system dominated by this aristocracy, they selected only members of the aristocracy to pass through the examinations and into government service. Likewise, the peninsula absorbed from the continent various forms of ideas and religious traditions. Buddhism, for example, Taoism, Confucianism, and you'll be hearing a lot more about Confucianism in a few moments. And interestingly enough, kind of parenthetically, the Koreans were first exposed to Christianity in the form of Catholicism in the early 17th century in Beijing, or Peking. So Christianity was initially introduced into the peninsula from the continent as well. That's subject for a whole another set of talks someplace. Now, very early on in the relations between the peninsula and the continent, back as early as the Three Kingdoms, in fact, there developed between a given Chinese dynasty and a given ruling house dynasty on the peninsula a very special relationship. I don't know of another relationship in human history similar to this relationship. It comes to be known as the Sa-dai relationship. You see the term, the Korean term right there, all right? This literally means to serve the great, and it's an allusion to a passage from an early classical Confucian text, which recognizes that if serving the great is a pragmatic policy of a principled ruler of a small kingdom, the benevolent ruler of a large kingdom will reciprocate in a neighborly fashion. Right? So if serving the great, think now in terms of the continent and the peninsula, if a principled ruler of the Korean kingdom serves the great ruler, the benevolent ruler of the great kingdom, China, that benevolent ruler then will respond in a neighborly fashion. This defined over centuries the role of a given ruling house or a given dynasty on the peninsula in the tribute system of a given Chinese dynasty. The legitimacy, the important thing to remember here is that the legitimacy of this concept was never challenged on the Korean peninsula, or not challenged on the Korean peninsula, I should say, until the year 1897. It was not always observed with, scrupulously. There were periods when it was not observed carefully, but it was never challenged. The legitimacy of the concept was not challenged until 1897. By the time we get to the late 14th century, and the founding of Chosun, the peninsula is under increasingly pervasive influence of Confucianism, or known by that time as Neo-Confucianism. So this relationship between the continent and the peninsula takes on another set of terminology under Confucian influence. It now becomes known as the elder brother, younger brother relationship. The Sa-dai relationship continues to exist, right? But it's also known as the elder brother, younger brother relationship. It is Confucianized. Two elements here. One, the hierarchical arrangement, the elder and the younger. The second, reciprocity. Each party has expectations of the other. Each party has obligations to the other. Now, I mentioned a moment ago, and I'm quickly getting to the point here, folks. I'm quickly getting to the point. But I had to give you this. I'm a historian. I had to give you this historical background to make the point with clarity and force, as I keep telling my students. 1897, near the end of the Chosun period, when the Chosun was founded in the late 14th century. This comes after more than a century of degrading occupation by the Mongols, of Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan, all of that. When they depart, there is a period of several decades of uncertainty and confusion and disorder on the peninsula. The group of people, the group of young men, young aristocrats, they're all part of this aristocracy, they emerge out of this victorious. They have been exposed to the principles of Neo-Confucianism. This is, I won't go into all the details here, but this is an updated version of classical Confucianism to meet the demands of the modern society in China back in the 9th and 10th centuries. Those ideas make their way into the peninsula, and the people who emerge as victorious out of this disorder in the late 14th century are determined to remake society according to the principles of Neo-Confucianism. Now, by this time, Confucianism has been influential on the peninsula for centuries, but only at the level of bureaucratic organization and bureaucratic administration. It hadn't penetrated society to affect, for example, the traditional Korean family, where the women still had far more influence than they were to have once Confucian influence took hold. That's another story. That's a whole nother story. Now, the founders of Chosun did not succeed in remaking society according to Confucian principles, but they did succeed, and now we're getting to the point here, they did succeed in establishing Neo-Confucianism as official state orthodoxy, to the point where it did percolate down through all of society, and it did indeed replace Buddhism in providing the spiritual orientation for the Korean people. All right? So, what we see happening now through the Chosun period, this is not something that, they could not suddenly proclaim this is going to happen in 1392 and see it happen. It took decades for this to happen. But what finally happens is that there is a convergence of certain principles of Neo-Confucianism with certain of those indigenous elements of Korean culture. And that convergence produced a deep-seated cultural characteristic that, I would argue, continues to affect the two Koreas, although in different ways. We continue to see, I would argue, the vestiges in both the North and the South of a deep-seated cultural characteristic that came out of this convergence of certain Neo-Confucian principles and certain elements of indigenous Korean society. The arbiters of Korean society and politics, the intellectual elite, the political elite, were obsessed, and they were representatives of the aristocracy, all right? They were obsessed with those elements of Neo-Confucianism that reinforced their determination to sustain this rigid hierarchical arrangement of society with them at the top, and everyone else paying deference to the people at the top. This complemented the Confucian insistence upon intellectual and philosophical purity. Now, I wish I had a few more hours available here, because I would dearly love to go into an analysis here of Confucian social and political thought. I used to teach a course on that, but again, that's in my next incarnation. Simply put, the Confucians, going back to the great sage himself, excuse me, assumed that every human being has the potential to become a genuine human being. a Confucian sage, right? Because each one of us has within, to use Confucian terminology, an equal share of the way of heaven. We each have within us all of those innate qualities that makes us potentially a perfect human being. It's up to every human being to realize it, to refine it, to express them, and then live accordingly. Once done, we're all behaving in this ideal fashion. Everything is harmonious. We're not talking order, we're talking harmony. Everyone is harmonious. There is no such thing as pluralism in Confucianism or Neo-Confucianism. No such thing as plural. So there is an aversion in Confucianism to compromise, negotiation, accommodation, resolution. We don't have to compromise or negotiate or make accommodations because you are either orthodox or you are not. And if you are not, you'd better become so. There's no halfway, right? There's nothing in between. So this insistence in Confucianism upon orthodoxy and orthodox behavior, conformity if you like, was deeply ingrained in Korean political culture at the turn of the 20th century. It became so much earlier, but it was still there. Now, there were dissidents by the time we get to the end of the 19th century in Korea. There were those who had been converted to Presbyterianism by this time. There were Methodists, and there were others who were dissidents. But still, deeply ingrained in Korean political culture at this point was this insistence upon orthodoxy and orthodox behavior, and this aversion to compromise and negotiation and to accommodation. And this was coupled with the unquestioning acceptance of the hierarchical arrangement of society, which was particularly acute for the people at the lower levels who were expected to pay deference at every turn to their superiors. Now, nothing occurred during the period of Japanese colonial rule from 1910 to 1945 to suppress this effect. In fact, the authoritarian nature of the colonial administration may have reinforced the inclination to accept an unwavering orthodoxy. This then is part of the legacy inherited by the Korean people at mid-century. This absolute insistence upon orthodoxy and this aversion to accommodation, to compromise, to negotiation. Now the question is, how did that legacy express itself? How does it express itself as we're moving into the second decade of the 21st century in North Korea and in South Korea? What is the evidence? What are the vestiges of that deep-seated cultural characteristic? During the period of Japanese administration, the expatriate leadership of the Koreans was scattered all over the globe. And there was no consensus leader among that group. They were in China. Some of them followed Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. Some of them followed Mao Zedong and the communists. They were in Manchukuo, Manchuria, now northeastern China, engaged in guerrilla warfare against the Japanese. That's where Kim Il-sung got his start. They were in the Soviet Union. By this time, by the end of the war, Kim Il-sung is in the Soviet Union. All right? They're in the United States, most famously Syngman Rhee. At the end of the war, in August of 1945, or soon thereafter, they make their way back to Pyongyang and Seoul, but there is no consensus leader. There's still fragmentation there, which is yet another cultural characteristic that I again, will set that aside for some future date. So there's no consensus leader. There are rightists, there are leftists, and there are, believe it or not, centrists who try to get everybody together. Make a long story short, by the late summer, early fall of 1948, Kim Il-sung is firmly established in Pyongyang. Syngman Rhee is firmly established in Seoul. Each now promulgates its own constitution. DPRK in Pyongyang, ROK in Seoul, each one claiming to be the legitimate ruler of all of the Korean people, and the other one is illegal. All right? And never the twain shall meet, we can say now in 2012. For more than 4 decades, both the people north of the 38th parallel and then the demilitarized zone, slightly, let me get the right map up here. Oop. There we are. For more than 4 decades, the people first north of the 38th parallel, then north of the demilitarized zone, lived under autocracy, autocratic governments, in both the North and the South. In the North, of course, one-man rule in the person of Kim Il-sung, well beyond the 4 decades until he dies in 1994. In the South, under Syngman Rhee until 1960, and then Park Chung-hee until 1979 when he is assassinated, and then Chun Doo-hwan. Autocratic government, North and South. Now, there were differences. In the North, the autocratic system was established in order to realize this grand vision of a socialist utopia. All right? The leaders in the North were driven by this magnificent vision of a socialist utopia. And there were no restraints on autocratic rule in the North. In the South, there was no grand vision. Autocracy in the South was a pragmatic strategy intended to achieve a specific objective, sustained economic growth and development. In fact, the autocracy in the South is called developmental autocracy. All right? And there were restraints on autocratic rule in the South, where there were no restraints on autocratic rule in the North. Now, it is tempting to attribute the longevity of the autocratic system in the North, the longevity of the Kim dynasty, and as you know, we're now into the 3rd generation of the Kim dynasty, from Kim Il-sung to Kim Jong-il, now to Kim Jong-un. It is tempting to attribute that longevity to this cultural element I mentioned a few moments ago, this cultural characteristic, right? This absolute insistence upon orthodoxy and orthodox behavior, this aversion to compromise, aversion to pluralism, acceptance of that structure. It is interesting to speculate about the role of that characteristic and the longevity of the system in the North in spite of repeated predictions of the immediate demise of the DPRK. And those predictions go back decades. Those predictions go back to, I had occasion the other day to talk to students about a column, an op-ed piece that appeared in the Wall Street Journal in 1990 predicting the early demise of the DPRK. Here we are in the year 2012 and it hasn't happened yet. But that begs the question of the transition in South Korea from autocracy to democracy that starts in 1987, 1988. What is the difference? I'll return to that in a few moments. For now, back to Pyongyang. As tempting as it is to attribute the longevity of the Kim dynasty, if you like, the Kim regime, at least in part, to the legacy of Chosun. For our purposes this morning, I am going to cite other evidence of that legacy. Evidence that bears directly on U.S. policymaking with regards to the DPRK, and evidence that bears directly on the relations between Pyongyang and the rest of the world, not just its immediate neighbors and sworn enemy in the United States, but the rest of the world. Now, as you know, DPRK behavior is often characterized as provocative, belligerent, irrational. Pick your own term. And people can cite evidence from its non-nuclear behavior and its nuclear behavior to justify those claims. And we've seen this recently again with the rocket launch, albeit a failure, and evidence that Pyongyang may be planning another nuclear test. And those are also terms that are used by people who have tried to negotiate with Pyongyang: irrational, provocative, belligerent, bellicose, threatening. Now, some observers of the DPRK, up-close observers of the DPRK, both in South Korea and in this country and elsewhere, suggest the possibility of not one, but two cultural characteristics at work here. Two characteristics inherited from the Chosun period. All right? One, rigidity and the aversion to compromise and accommodation, inevitably returning to the conviction that we are correct. And there's no need, therefore, for us to negotiate, for us to compromise, for us to make concessions. We are correct, and everyone else is going to have to recognize that and get in line with us. That is one of those cultural characteristics some people identify as responsible, at least a factor that plays into the behavior of the DPRK in the international arena. The second one is very interesting. It has, in a sense, it is a negative cultural influence from the Chosun, the determination to break the hold of the Sadai mentality, the determination not to become subservient to a foreign power. Now, Kim Il-sung has often when he was still alive, would often criticize, and his son did it. I don't know if his grandson has done it yet, but probably will. But Kim Il-sung was very fond of criticizing, in the harshest of terms, Seoul for its subservient position vis-a-vis Washington, for continuing to behave according to the Sadai mentality of the old days, continuing this subservience to the United States. This brings to mind a statement that was made in the late 1890s by a very famous Chosun reformer and nationalist, and in fact convert to Methodism, as I recall. He said the following: "Long centuries of dependence on China have made Koreans think and feel that Korea can never be anything but a dependency of some great power. A Korean takes to national vassalage as naturally as a duck takes to water." And in fact, during the period of Japanese colonial rule, those Koreans, certainly some of them who openly collaborated with the Japanese, said that they were doing so in the Sadai spirit. We are now serving the new great, no longer China, now Japan, in the long-term interests of Korea. So this is something, the Sadai mentality is something that was deeply ingrained in the Korean psyche, it seems to me. So is it unreasonable to suggest that the behavior of Pyongyang in the international arena is an extreme reaction against the Sadai mentality? An extreme effort, perhaps, to avoid subservience. Might this be a factor in the repeated call from Pyongyang for bilateral negotiations with the United States? Quite apart from the six-party talks, yet another topic to be put aside here. But might not this be to develop a sense of equality with the United States? Right? It seems to me that that is a factor that should be taken into account. So as a preliminary conclusion, I would say, or I would certainly suggest, that the relationship between Pyongyang and the rest of the world is informed, at least in part, by an aversion, an inherited cultural aversion to compromise and negotiation, and in part an inherited, and in part an aversion to subservience. And then there is always that other interesting possibility that a cultural element inherited from Chosun is a factor in the longevity of the Kim autocracy. Now, to the ROK. Now, I said I was going to leap across the barriers, and I'm doing that now, from the north to the south. And I want to spend a few moments now talking about the Republic of Korea and the transition from autocracy to democracy. That transition took place, started with the election of late 1987. The new president took office in January of 1988. This marks the beginning of the transition from autocracy to democracy. Very briefly, off and on over the years, there were demonstrations in the streets. First, these demonstrations drove Syngman Rhee from office in 1960. They continued to demonstrate, the people continued to demonstrate against Park Chung-hee, against Chun Doo-hwan. This reaches a crescendo in the summer of 1987 in favor of direct presidential elections. Now, there had not been a direct presidential election in South Korea since the early 1970s. Following, Park Chung-hee came very close to losing in a direct presidential election, so that was that. Through the rest of the 70s and into most of the 80s, the president was elected by carefully selected electors within an electoral college within the National Assembly, which was not open to direct election either. So the government party always won, all right? The party representing the autocracy always won. Now, by June of 1987, there is this crescendo in the streets, and Chun Doo-hwan finally says, okay, the election in December will be direct. The focus here has been on, for years in South Korea, on civil society and civil society groups demonstrating in the streets, reminding the leaders that we want something else, something other than what we have, right? The focus has not been on political society, political culture, and political parties. They did not discuss issues, policies. They were determined by Park Chung-hee and Chun Doo-hwan. The debate here was between autocracy on the one hand and democracy on the other hand. And those representing the interests of democracy finally prevail at the end of the 1980s. Now, this period of transition continued through the administration of No Tai-woo. There we are. A little offline there, but No Tai-woo, through the administration of Kim Young-sam, and into the administration of Kim Dae-jung. At that point, we are told, the process of democratic consolidation started. Right? The process of democratic consolidation started. Now, with democratic consolidation, the focus is supposed to shift from from the civil society and civil society groups to political society and political parties. The discussion and debate now shifts from autocracy versus democracy to the issues. Parties now assume increasing importance. Parties that represent a position on a certain issue. I belong to this party because I agree with its position on this issue. You belong to that party because you agree with its position on that issue. This was supposed to be the case, but that's not what happened. That's not what happened by the end of the administration of Kim Dae-jung. It did not happen during the administration of Roh Moo-hyun. It has not happened during the administration of Lee Myung-bak. You'll note that each one serves 5 years. That's the term in office of a president in South Korea, and they may not run for re-election. We have another election coming up in December of this year. So what happened? What's going on here? Right? By this time, Instead, we still see groups in the streets demonstrating. Within 100 days of Lee Myung-bak's election, he was almost run from office. Demonstrations in the streets, partly because he continued to support the importing of American beef, you remember. This was after the mad cow disease scare. All right? Civil society groups are still out there reminding the leaders of what it means to be a democracy. Now, by this time, there's supposed to be acceptance of the values of democracy, the principles and truths of democracy, without having to be reminded constantly by the civil society groups. But that has not happened. I will quote here a couple of characterizations of South Korean political culture. It remains under-institutionalized, dichotomized, paralyzed, and immobilized, polarized, petrified, and problem-ridden. At a little more length, and these two quotes come from early in this decade, all right? From the outset, South Korea's transition to democracy was arguably more procedural than substantive. A conservative democratization which has failed to produce a party system representative of the real diversity of the interest in Korean society. And from a longer editorial in a Seoul daily newspaper, I'll cut this down a bit. Korean democracy is facing a grave crisis. If we can say we started the first phase of democratization in 1987, now is our last chance to move towards the second phase. Last chance, he is saying. This was in 2009. To move towards the second phase. If the first phase started with the overcoming of dictatorship and authoritarianism, identified with corrupt elections, prolonged one-man rule, and breaches of the Constitution, the second phase of democratization should be built on a rule of law and democratic procedures upholding the Constitution. Korean politics has failed to operate with democratic procedures during the last 20 years because of the deep-rooted backwardness of political parties, progressive and conservative alike. Now, if some of this is starting to sound familiar, we can address that issue during the Q&A period. Korea's progressive forces continue to stick to fights and demonstrations, failing to organize themselves into a popular, broad-based party that practices democratic politics. The current ruling party, which represents conservative forces, has failed to grow up into a popular, broad-based political party, and its outdated internal factional politics sickens many. That's a pretty strong statement about party politics in South Korea just a couple of years ago. The point here is that there have been no major changes in South Korean politics since the beginning of the process of liberalization and democratization in the late 1980s. Inter-party politics continued to be hostile, uncompromising, and uncivil. Now again, that may sound familiar, but we can talk about that later on. There is a distinction to be made here, a very important distinction, and I hope we can make it in a few minutes. During the years of authoritarian government, 60s, 70s, 80s, there was a natural dichotomy and hostility between the parties. The government party favored autocracy, the opposition parties favored democracy. And never the twain shall meet. But those conditions no longer existed after the election of 1987. And certainly no longer existed as we worked through the administrations of No Tai-woo and Kim Yoon-sam and Kim Dae-jung and so on. So what's going on? How do we explain the continued hostility between the... And I want to emphasize here that this hostility is not based on issues. The hostility is not based on difference of opinion over the economy, or differences of opinion over health care, or differences of opinion over you pick the issue. That's the distinction here. Here, there's hostility simply because we belong to two different parties. Now what's happening? The people in Korea find the civil society groups very, very appealing. So civil society groups continue to function. Civil society groups are still out there in the streets demonstrating against the political leaders. In some cases, it gets rather delicate, right? So the people find the civil society groups to be a very, very attractive option to dysfunctional political parties. So what's going on here? Well, it is quite possible that we see three cultural elements at work here. One will sound familiar to you, but I'll start with bossism. Political bossism is alive and well in South Korea. Parties are under the direction of strong leaders. Secondly, regionalism, which is a historical reality in Korea, even that small peninsula, regionalism. So what becomes of paramount importance here is establishing and energizing a regional electoral base. So more important than encouraging the emergence of a leader who wants to discuss and debate issues, you have to find a leader who can energize that regional electoral base, right? And this simply reinforces bossism. Now, this brings me to item number 3. These two related factors of bossism and regionalism are simply exacerbated by an updated, politicized aversion to compromise and accommodation. An updated, politicized aversion to compromise, negotiation, accommodation. So what does all of this have to do with American foreign policy, you're asking yourselves about now, I'm sure. As a case study, I cite the Korean-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. Right there. The Korean-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. This is the shorthand that you see in the literature. Now, some of you may remember the Korean-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. It was first announced in 2006. Negotiations were concluded in April of 2007. Treaty was signed in June of 2007, was renegotiated and re-signed then in December of 2010. The treaty was ratified by the U.S. Congress in October of 2011, was ratified by the National Assembly in Seoul in November of 2011. The Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement went into effect on March 15, 2012. But that is hardly the end of the story. The provisions include the elimination of 95% of each nation's tariffs on goods within 5 years. 95%. And they also include the creation of new protections for multinational financial services and other types of multinational corporations. For the U.S., this was the first free trade agreement with a major Asian economy and was the largest free trade agreement since the signing of the controversial NAFTA back in 1993. For South Korea, it's the second largest free trade agreement it ever signed, second only to the free trade agreement it signed with the European Union several years ago. So what's going on here? Why is this such a good case study to illustrate my point? Keep in mind there are two distinctly different, in name, political parties. The Conservative Party that was known until recently as the Grand National Party, the GNP. For some reason, they changed their name. Well, they don't give an English translation of it, but one translation of the Korean is the New Frontier Party. This is the Conservative Party, all right? The second is the Liberal or the Progressive Party called the United Democratic Party. For a long time, it was called the Democratic Party. Then they brought in other progressive parties. It's now the United Democratic Party. So you've got these two parties. Now, as I said a moment ago, the Free Trade Agreement was signed by the National Assembly in December 2011. This is what happened. Late one night, just about midnight. And the Conservatives, at that point it was still known as the GNP, they controlled the National Assembly. They called a vote late in the middle of the night. They called a surprise vote on the Free Trade Agreement. I quote, "The long-stalled Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement was finally ratified by the National Assembly yesterday after the ruling Grand National Party blindsided liberal opposition lawmakers with a surprise floor vote in a chaotic session complete with a tear gas attack in the main chamber. Our politics have not yet reached that level. So, a tear gas attack. Apparently what happened was that a member of the opposition here, member of the Liberal Party, to express his opposition to this blindsiding, this late night vote, set off a smoke bomb. Other versions are smoke bomb and not tear gas, but they set off. Now, so what's going on here? What's the point? I quote here from the leader of the opposition. Now, this was before the National Assembly elections about 2 weeks ago, April 11th, the latest National Assembly elections. This is a quote from the leader of the opposition, right, the United Democratic Party, assuming that they were going to win those National Assembly elections. All council members, that's the council of the the Democratic United Party, agree that the Koros FTA was lopsided and flawed. We shall abolish the entire pact and restart the talks from scratch. Why? I quote further from an editorial that appeared about that, and the Korean newspapers are full of editorials about this now. The blogs, stuff online, full of all this stuff. This is a condensation of everything I have. The Koreans and the Democratic United Party were angry not about the ratification itself, but upset about the method that the GNP and the government had used in the ratification process. The blindsiding of the opposition late, around midnight one night. And that statement is echoed throughout the Korean press, the blogs, observers both within South Korea and from the outside. The opposition is challenging the Korea-US Free Trade Agreement less because of its provisions than because of deep-seated party animosity and hostility. You don't see the leader of the Democratic United Party, rarely do you see references to the provisions of the Free Trade Agreement. We are going to abolish it and start all over from scratch. Why? Just because we are going to abolish it and start all over from scratch. Why are you going to do that? Just because, I'm serious, it gets to be that monotonous. It gets to be almost that monotonous, right? I also note that there are demonstrations in the streets against the Free Trade Agreement. So we're back to civil society and civil society groups assuming a prominent role here because the political parties are ineffectual, because they are so obsessed with this animosity and hostility and refusal. You see, you don't see any discussion here that, well, this provision, oh, we can accept that. This one, no. But I'll tell you what, we'll let you keep this if we abolish this and we'll get together on this one. Nothing like that. Nothing like that, all right? They don't even hint at that. We're opposed to it. You get down to basics, we're opposed to it because you favor it. It's that simple. Now, in February of 2012, an observer, kind of expanding on everything I've said here, looking forward to the National Assembly elections that I said were held in April, and then the presidential election, said this. Fortunately, he has already had his say about this legislative session that ratified the FTA. Fortunately, he says, Korea has one more chance. This year's 2 elections. I hope Koreans vote for the policy and not for the party. I do hope that Korean politicians appeal to voters with great policies, not by criticizing the opposition party. People do not need more childish politicking between the two parties. Now, implicit in that statement, and I took that out of context, but he has spent a lot of time complaining about what happened around the free trade agreement. Implicit in this statement is a concern over the retarded state of democratic consolidation in the ROK. Quite possibly, it seems to me, retarded in part by the deep-seated cultural factor inherited from Chosun. This aversion to compromise, negotiation, accommodation, resolution. All right? So I see that characteristic at work in the North, but you see it expressed most prominently there in DPRK relations with the outside world. I see it here expressed most prominently in the political culture. What does this have to do with American policy? I think that you've got to, if you're dealing with the DPRK, not only the United States, but look, I was telling the students in class on what day is today? Wednesday. On Monday, I think I'll retire. That when I talk about North Korea, I am often accused of being pro-Pyongyang and pro-Kim dynasty. No, that's not true. That is, and therefore evil. All right, and therefore evil. That's not true. I'm not pro-Pyongyang, and I'm not pro-Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un. I am trying to take a broad view here. Folks, policies have not worked. We're 65 years on here. Policies have not worked. All right? I think it is important for policymakers in Washington, in Seoul, in Tokyo, in Beijing, in Moscow, wherever, to take into account the possibility that we see this as one factor that contributes to the belligerence of Pyongyang. All right? And adjust our strategies accordingly. When it comes to the South, we have to take into account the retarded state of democratic consolidation, being prepared for the very real possibility, depending on what happens in December. If a representative of the Democratic United Party wins that presidential election, is it possible that the hard-won Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, which I think is a good idea, could be completely wiped off the board? We have to be prepared for that possibility, and we have to make contingencies accordingly. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And I thought our politics were polarized. My.
Well, let me make one point here, if I may. All right. The difference, and I was laughing at chuckling all the while as I was putting this together, because people are going to be saying, "Wait a minute, you're describing our politics here." Big difference here. No discussion of issues here. Here we discuss issues. We don't discuss them in a civil manner. We don't respond in a civil manner, but we do discuss health care. We do discuss what's the big issue right now? College loans. I mean, you can't look at a newspaper, turn on the internet, turn on a radio or television set without hearing a discussion. They're yelling at each other, but about policies and about issues. That's not what we see here in South Korea. We don't see that. Now, I'm not saying no one discusses an issue, but that has not prevailed. That has not yet prevailed. And the continued vibrancy and vitality of the civil society groups in the streets is a symptom of this retarded growth of democracy in South Korea.
Thank you very much. That's certainly very informative and gives us a lot of food for thought. I would like people to queue up over here if you have questions for Professor Dimberg, and we can get started on those. Professor, I'd like to start off with the first question, which doesn't really have to do with the politics, but the families have been separated by the division of Korea into North and South. What should we appreciate about their ancestry and the effects on modern-day relations by this separation of the families themselves?
Oh, boy. How much time do we have? All afternoon. Yeah, no. It's heartbreaking. I mean, it is heartbreaking that families were separated. I recommend two titles if you want to read about this. Both by the same Korean-American author from Los Angeles, OLLI. In the absence of sun, no, that's the second one. The first one is, oh my, Still Life with Rice. Still Life with Rice. And the subsequent volume is In the Absence of Sun, as in S-U-N, by He-Lee. L-E-E is the family name, H-E-L-I-E. This is a marvelous story of a family. It's true. It's a true story of a family that was torn apart by the Korean War. They assumed that the eldest son here, the uncle of the author, was killed. But he turns up via a telephone call to the family apartment in Los Angeles because he has heard about the book, the first book, Still Life with Rice, which was the story of his mother. It's his mother's life. And he calls. He finds out where he calls them. And they ultimately get them out of North Korea. It's a marvelous story. Depressing in many ways, but I recommend those two books to you, and they're both in paperback. I don't know what more to say. I've talked to people. I have students whose families have been separated now for 50, 55, 60 years, right? They know, or they assume, they have cousins in North Korea, and so on and so forth, and they've just resigned themselves to the fact that they may well never see that branch of the family again. It is a terrible, terrible set of circumstances. There were some reunions some years back, you may recall, and there talk off and on about renewing that, but I think no plans are underway to renew those reunions at all.
And the communications are completely cut off?
Yeah. It's less so now because of the internet and iPhones and iPads and all this new technology, and some of this is infiltrating North Korea, being smuggled in and so on, and that helps a little bit. But still, yes, officially and formally, communications are severed.
Thank you very much. Can we have the first question, please?
Yeah, I really have two questions. One is, where do the Chinese come in on all this? In terms of, what kind of influence, we read about it a little bit from time to time, but what kind of influence do they have? And in terms of our relations with China and North Korea, is there any prospect of improvements down the road? And my second question, just a minor point, is I'd be curious to know the derivation of those names for Kim Il-sung and Kim Il-un, and where's the father's name and the mother's name? How does that work out?
Well, Kim is the family name. Kim is the family name, and Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un, the middle syllable, the first syllable of the given name. As you know, the family name comes first, one syllable, and then the given name is follows in two syllables. The Jung, Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un, that Jung is the same, and that's important in that one generation to the next. But then the distinction is made in the second syllable of that given name, Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un. All right? So this is all patriarchal and patrilineal, believe me. All patriarchal and patrilineal. No. Now back to the first question, how much influence, there were two or three questions there, but the Chinese do have influence over Pyongyang, but they tread with care. The Chinese would rather see a nuclear North Korea than a collapsed North Korea. All right? Because a collapsed North Korea would mean untold hundreds of thousands of refugees in northeastern China. And I can understand why Beijing does not want that. All right? So they would rather see a nuclear North Korea than a collapsed North Korea. So they are reluctant, or they refuse to say either you denuclearize, as you have promised to do more than once over the years, or we will cut off all aid and so on and so forth. That's not to the advantage of the Chinese. Although they have recently rescinded the policy, canceled the policy of repatriating refugees from North Korea. Just within the past week or so, it was announced, right? They would always threaten to send back any refugee apprehended, understanding the consequences for the repatriated refugee. They've canceled that policy. This is a very interesting move. This could be simply the first step. And they have on occasion had influence over the leader in Pyongyang, whether it's Kim Il-sung or Kim Jong-il. We'll see how much influence they have over Kim Jong-un. I can imagine our policymakers losing sleep over this triangular relationship. But it has to be multilateral. This dealing with North Korea has to be multilateral because the origin of this was multilateral, not bilateral, all right? You've got to include Japan, South Korea, China, and Russia, and the United States, all right? The three-way relationship between Washington, Beijing, and Pyongyang is very, very delicate because we have to consider not only our relationship with North Korea, but our relationship with China as well, right? So this is a very, very delicate issue for the policymakers dealing with Northeast Asia. I have no resolution to this. I remember once after giving a talk at the Miller Center a year and a half ago, someone said, what do you suggest as a resolution to this? And I said, I have no idea. And he said, I can understand that. If you did, you wouldn't be here. And I asked him afterwards, I said, what do you mean? He said, you'd be in Washington making policy. I'm sorry I can't give you a more definitive answer than that, but it's very, very delicate. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I enjoyed the discussion about the leaders in both countries, but what about the people themselves, the differences that have been developing there? I just read something that they're finding that the citizens and a lot of the people in North Korea are developing and they're ending up 3 inches shorter than the South Koreans.
That's right. I thought that's where you were going with that. That's a result of the famine of the mid-90s. There's a series of natural disasters coupled with bad policy. I mean, bad economic policy was part of this because the people were already running short of food before the disasters hit. But then there was a series of floods, hailstorms, and a tidal wave that destroyed the reserves, but also the crops and the coal mines and the coal reserves, so they couldn't ship it there. It was an enormous disaster, human disaster. South Korea responded, we responded, the Chinese did, the UN did, and so on. But there was large-scale starvation and disease. And what they are seeing now in North Korea are the effects of that, where children who were on the verge of starvation but who survived are, on average, 3 or 4 inches shorter than their contemporaries in South Korea. And it also had to have an effect on their mental and emotional development as well. Yes, that is certainly true. All of that is true. And it was a human disaster of enormous proportions. And it was 95, 96, 97. The recovery finally started at the end of the decade and into the 21st century. But bad policy, I'm not blaming it all on nature. Bad policy was a factor here.
In the South, what role does the business community, particularly Samsung, Hyundai, play in the political process? Money passing, or what happens with that?
In one of the quotes, I deleted the reference to the business-dominated politics because it got too complicated. The chaebol, Samsung, Hyundai, you name them. They are not as influential now as they were before the financial crisis of 1998. When Kim Dae-jung took office, he took office right in the middle of that horrendous financial crisis. You remember the Asian flu that started in Thailand, Singapore, Hong Kong, and so on. It hit South Korea in 1997, 1998. In the monetary, what am I trying to think of here? The monetary fund. IMF. the International Monetary Fund bailed them out with an enormous amount of money on the provision that they would change the system and introduce something that was completely alien to the South Korean economy, and that was transparency. There was collusion between the chaebol and which are kind of family-dominated business organizations, and the government. And this is one reason why the economy suffered so terribly in the late 1990s. Some element of transparency was introduced, and the civil society groups got involved. The civil society groups are still involved in observing the legislators and the chaebol. So they don't have the same role now that they had 10 years ago, but Korean, or 15 years ago, but Korean political culture still shows the signs of the influence of the chaebol from earlier years. They're still influential, not as influential as they were, but the damage was done. I think that they contribute.
Go ahead, we have.
Going back to when the Neo-Confucianism merged with the indigenous culture, I want to just be sure I got this correctly. Was there the paradox that on the one hand, the hierarchy remained obsessed with sustaining its position, and yet at the same time, sort of through the spiritual dimension, there was a common belief that all people were created with sort of an equal divine spark?
Good. Now, there you are. I could go on here for an hour on that subject. In Confucianism, there is a sense of equality in that we all have an equal potential to become genuine human beings. We all share, from the monarch on down, we all share, and we're supposed, in classical Confucianism, we're supposed to achieve that by following the example of the monarch, right? We all share in common. We all have an equal share of this way of heaven, which means we are all equal morally, potentially, all right? There's a potential moral equality that does not carry over into the arrangement of society. That does not carry over into social equality or political equality. Moral equality, yes. Social and political, no. There's a text, a passage in a classical Confucian text, the Mengzi, the Mencius. Some people are rulers, some people are ruled. Or governors are governed, right? The rulers labor with their minds, the ruled labor with their backs. All right? This is a paraphrase, but the rulers rule the low, people at the lower levels, the ruled support the rulers, all right? A clear vindication of social inequality with political power in the hands of the few, all right? So there was no contradiction. To the contrary, one thing about Confucianism and Neo-Confucian that appealed to the elite in Chosun was precisely that passage. Because not only does it vindicate the propriety of political dominance by an elite, it reinforces what was already on the peninsula. It reinforces that indigenous characteristic. All right? So there was a natural convergence of the two. They simply reinforced each other once Neo-Confucianism was made official state orthodoxy.
Yes, sir. While it doesn't directly relate to culture, it does deal with news today and yesterday. I'd be interested in your views of the son, the junior up north, and some of his saber rattling the last few days. His father was pretty good at taking things to the brink, and then knowing when to back off. But this young guy we know nothing about, and in light of his missile going awry, he might just want to be feeling his oats. I guess my question is, what can you look at that week and prognosticate, or what's your thoughts on what might happen 6-8 months from now? I mean, it's still the same old stuff, or are we in for maybe some more serious?
So you're asking me to make a prediction about North Korea?
I can't think of anyone better to comment on that.
The last time I did that, I said I would never do it again, and that was in 1995. I gave a talk in the dome room of the Rotunda, and I predicted that Korea would be united sometime around the middle of the first decade of the 21st century. The only prediction I've made since was about NFL football scores in competition with my two grandsons, and they normally beat me.
That's because you're a baseball expert.
Yeah. All right. Now, number one, once that missile crashed into the sea, there were a lot of people saying that we haven't heard the end of this. This will reverberate through Pyongyang, and we should anticipate something aggressive. And he comes out and threatens South Korea with annihilation and so on. So I was not surprised to hear it. It didn't make me happy. I'm going to remind myself to say something when I finish here, something I neglected to say during my prepared remarks. I'm not happy to see that, but it didn't surprise me. It didn't surprise me. I don't know of anyone who knows exactly the composition of the group around Kim Jong-un. We know that a relative may well be kind of the prince regent, but no one is absolutely certain of that either. This man was promoted in rank just before Kim Jong-il died and so on, so the feeling is that he may be wielding some power, certainly a lot of influence. What I do not anticipate during the year 2012 is any kind of a major upheaval, because this is the centennial of the birth of Kim Il-sung. He was born the day the Titanic went down. 3 major events: Titanic, Kim Il-sung, Fenway Park. True, that's true. That's true. So I would be very, very surprised. I'm not surprised at the saber rattling, but I would be very surprised at any kind of a major upheaval this year. Now, beyond that, I can't predict. And a prominent Korea expert at Columbia, I quoted him a couple of times here, his name is Charles Armstrong, said fairly recently in a alumni magazine, Columbia Alumni Magazine, that said, and I'm not quoting him directly, but he said, in effect, no Korea specialist in his or her right mind will make any kind of prediction about what's going to happen in North Korea. The only thing I will say is that reunification is not a realistic topic for conversation right now. Sadly, I don't think it is.
I might close with the last question. We in this program are attempting to bridge the cultural deficit gap that Professor Ramazani alluded to. And having a business downtown and being associated with Rotary, I see a lot of interaction between South Koreans coming over here not only for education, but as tourists and things. What do you think the influence is back in South Korea by their exposure to our culture, and both in education and just the general culture as a population of a tourist?
Well, number one, remember I said here, if we try to explain the longevity of the Kim dynasty in terms of that cultural element I talked about in my remarks, that begs the question of the transition from autocracy to democracy in South Korea. Why didn't it work the same way in South Korea? I think in part because of an American policy back in the 60s and 70s and 80s to bring to the United States young South Korean intellectuals, teachers, artists, attorneys, aspiring politicians, whatever, for tutoring in the principles and the values of democracy. They went back, and I think what we saw at the end of the 1980s and into the 1990s and beyond was the beneficial effect of that policy. So this influence has been going on for a long, long time. It's not always been positive. Anti-Americanism was very, very strong in South Korea at one point. In fact, No Mo-hyun, who succeeded Kim Dae-jung, and he sadly committed suicide, a couple of years after he left office. One of his planks in his platform when he was running for office was kind of a subtle anti-Americanism. So I'm told that anti-Americanism is on the wane, that polls show that there's a generation gap, but that even young Koreans are becoming more favorably inclined toward the United States than they were before. The senior citizens are favorably inclined because they're the ones who remember the Korean War and remember what we did. But the younger generation for years has been very cynical about the United States. That seems to be changing. Maybe because of the enormous number of Korean students studying in the United States and going back to Korea and leaving the United States with a favorable impression. I think that when we deal with Korean expatriates or Korean tourists or whatever, we have to be very, very careful and be very sensitive about these very cultural issues that we've been discussing here.
Thank you very much, Professor Dimberg.
My pleasure, thank you.
Very enlightening. I would like to invite you to return for our 6th session next week. We're going to have a presentation by Professor Womack on China, and that will conclude this series, and we'll probably, hopefully, see you again next spring. I want to correct one thing. I think that the students were also here from Monticello High. So thank you again. Have a good day.